There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
The announcement did not come from a distant spokesman or an anonymous palace notice. It came from Prince William and Princess Anne standing together under the weight of what they had learned. Their expressions revealed the truth before either spoke. King Charles had suffered a serious deterioration in his health. His public duties had been suspended, and the monarchy was confronting the possibility it had tried to avoid. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William gripped the lectern and continued. He confirmed that his father had endured an overnight medical crisis, followed by a decline requiring specialist supervision. The prince paused before explaining that public engagements, private audiences, ceremonial duties, and non-essential constitutional meetings had been suspended. A private audience is a closed meeting between the sovereign and an invited official, while a constitutional meeting involves formal duties tied to government. Those cancellations mattered because Charles had built his reign around visible service, and because every empty space in his calendar raised one brutal question: who would stand in his place? Anne did not move. She did not speak. Yet her face revealed the cost of royal control. The Princess Royal had spent decades defending her older brother through conflict and criticism. Now she stood beside his son, knowing the man she had treated as indestructible might never return to the life he knew. William felt that terror, but his burden was crueler. He was speaking as a frightened child while the world studied him as the future king. Then his voice changed. According to the recorded palace statement, the king's condition had become more serious than the family had hoped. William set his notes down as though the sentence had become too heavy to hold. Anne glanced toward him, then faced forward again. Neither explained that senior family members had been summoned during the night, but the timing exposed how quickly the crisis had deepened and why the announcement could no longer be delayed. William quietly confirmed that constitutional contingency plans had been reviewed. These were emergency arrangements designed to keep essential royal duties functioning if the sovereign became unable to perform them. He refused to reveal how far those preparations had advanced. That silence landed harder than any official phrase. As the statement ended, Anne touched her nephew's arm before they turned away. The gesture lasted 1 second, but it carried a promise. Behind those carefully chosen words stood 3 people facing 3 different fears: the suffering sovereign, the son being pulled toward the throne, and the sister determined never to let either man face the darkness alone. Long before the cameras captured their strained expressions, William and Anne had entered a private battle that no title could soften. One was watching his father weaken while the crown moved closer with terrifying speed. The other was watching her brother confront his mortality behind guarded doors. Between them stood Charles, determined to remain useful even as his body demanded that he surrender control. Charles reached towards the table and asked for the next red box. But William placed one hand firmly on its lid. A red box is a secure case containing government papers that the sovereign must review as part of official duties. Those papers represented more than work to the king. They were proof that he still mattered, that his reign still moved through his hands, and that illness had not yet reduced him to a silent figure, waiting for others to decide his future. William closed the box. He told his father that no document was more important than following the doctor's instructions. Charles stared at him with sudden anger, but the anger quickly faded. He admitted that stepping away felt like abandoning the duty he had waited most of his life to perform. The confession struck the prince hard. Protecting his father now required him to assume responsibilities that looked dangerously like the first steps toward replacing him. Anne moved closer before the silence could harden. She reminded her brother that accepting care was not surrender, and that protecting the monarchy also meant protecting the man wearing the crown. Charles heard the compassion in her voice, yet he also sensed the fear beneath it. She had defended him through family conflict, public criticism, and decades of uncertainty. Now the Princess Royal feared that his pride might turn necessary rest into a personal defeat. Camilla stood near the closed door, shaken by how quickly the crisis had deepened. She asked whether doctors had withheld the complete medical picture to prevent panic inside the family. The Queen Consort received no clear answer, and that silence disturbed her more than any formal statement. Charles noticed her expression and reached toward her, but even that small movement seemed to cost him strength. Catherine found William later, still studying revised schedules long after everyone else had left. She recognised the habit immediately. The Princess of Wales knew he hid fear by becoming useful, and she warned that duty could not protect him from grief forever. William insisted he was preparing only for the next few days, but she saw the truth. He was already preparing for a world in which his father could no longer lead. Anne suddenly remembered the ceremony when Charles first reached for a chair and whispered that the room was spinning. At the time, the family had called it exhaustion. Now she understood it as the warning they had refused to name. To grasp why the announcement carried such devastating force, they would have to return to that moment, the brief stumble that became the point of no return. The crisis did not begin with the overnight summons. Its true beginning came days earlier during a private investiture meant to prove that strength and continuity still held. Charles entered, determined to complete every duty placed before him. Yet halfway through the ceremony, his hand tightened around a chair. His words faltered, and Anne saw something in her brother's face that turned concern into fear. Charles had already accepted a reduced schedule, but even that lighter programme remained demanding. The king believed each carefully controlled appearance reassured the country and protected the monarchy from whispers of weakness. An investiture is a formal ceremony in which the sovereign presents honours to people recognised for public service or achievement. Cancelling it would have disappointed recipients who had waited years for that moment, and he feared another absence would make illness appear stronger than the crown. Charles began reading the next citation, then suddenly lost his place. He looked down, tried again, and reached for the chair beside him. Anne moved before the nearest aide understood what was happening. She caught her brother by the elbow as he whispered that the room had started spinning. The Princess Royal ordered everyone outside, but he resisted through clenched teeth, insisting the ceremony must continue. Anne refused. She guided him into the chair and told the aides to clear the room immediately. Charles stared at her with anger sharpened by humiliation. The sovereign had spent his reign presenting service as discipline, so losing control in front of others felt like a public defeat. He accused those around him of treating him like a patient instead of a monarch. She answered that no title could command a failing body into silence. Charles confronted his sister again after the medical team arrived. According to a documented account prepared for senior palace officials, Anne told him that stubbornness was no longer courage when it could turn a warning into a national emergency. The king rejected the accusation, yet his hands still trembled. She saw the fear he refused to name, and he saw the pity he could not bear to receive. Doctors completed urgent examinations and found a troubling change that required constant monitoring. Charles listened, then asked that William not be summoned until they were certain. He claimed he wanted to protect his son from unnecessary alarm, but Anne warned that delaying the truth would create a deeper wound. The monarch held firm. William later discovered that precious hours had passed while the palace tried to contain the crisis. His grief hardened into anger, not toward the doctors, but toward his father, who had chosen silence over trust. That anger would soon erupt behind a closed door, where two future kings finally faced each other as a frightened son and a dying father. For years, Charles and William had survived disagreement through restraint. They measured words, concealed wounds, and allowed duty to end arguments that love could not resolve. But the health crisis shattered that discipline. With no aides present and no cameras nearby, William demanded to know why he had been kept outside the truth. Charles answered with the pride of a king and the fear of a father who knew what the truth would force his son to become. William closed the study door and placed the cancelled engagement schedule on the desk. He had learned about the severity of the crisis only after doctors had called for urgent monitoring and constitutional planning had already begun. Constitutional planning means preparing lawful ways for royal duties to continue if the sovereign becomes unable to perform them. That delay mattered because the prince was not only the heir. He was a son who had been denied the chance to stand beside his father before fear turned into an emergency. William looked directly at him. "How ill did you intend to become before you trusted me with the truth?" Charles rose at once, anger pushing him forward, but his strength failed before his words did. The king gripped the desk, became unsteady, and lowered himself into the chair. The silence that followed struck harder than the accusation. Both men understood what had just happened, and neither could pretend otherwise. Charles insisted that he had been protecting his son from uncertain information and from premature discussion about succession. William rejected the explanation. He accused his father of confusing control with protection, and said the secrecy had forced him to enter the crisis as an heir instead of as family. The prince's voice cracked only once, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. Charles finally admitted the truth through a recorded private conversation later preserved in the palace's internal account. He could not bear to watch William's face change from concern to readiness. That expression, he said, would confirm that his son was preparing for a world without him. The king had feared that look more than the illness itself. William stepped back, stunned by the confession, but Charles opened a drawer and removed preliminary contingency papers. They allowed the heir and selected councillors of state, senior royals legally permitted to perform limited duties for the monarch, to assume greater responsibility if his condition worsened. The documents proved that the king had prepared for the very future he refused to discuss. Anne entered after hearing the raised voices. She told both men that the medical team now required an immediate decision about how much authority Charles could safely retain. William picked up the papers, but no reconciliation followed. The family's pain had become a struggle over power, and whoever controlled those documents might control the monarchy's next chapter. Power inside a monarchy rarely changes hands with one dramatic command. It moves quietly through cancelled meetings, redirected papers, altered briefings, and signatures placed where another hand once ruled. As Charles remained under medical care, William approached a room filled with constitutional advisors waiting for him to act. Yet the most powerful person present was still the absent king, whose wishes shaped every decision. William stopped outside the meeting room and removed his glasses. He pressed his fingers against his eyes, fighting the exhaustion he had hidden since the crisis began. Catherine stood beside him and reminded the prince that leadership did not require emotional numbness. Her words mattered because he was being asked to reassure the country while privately fearing for his father, and because every duty he accepted could look like another step toward the throne. William entered and immediately refused the chair normally used by Charles. He chose the seat beside it instead. The gesture was small, but everyone understood it. A constitutional meeting is a formal discussion about how royal responsibilities can continue within the law when illness prevents the sovereign from performing certain duties. The monarch's authority remained intact. Yet practical work had to move somewhere, and that movement carried dangerous meaning. Anne supported expanding her nephew's role, but her voice sharpened when advisors began speaking too easily about permanence. She warned them not to turn medical necessity into an unofficial accession, meaning a transfer of power that looks like the start of a new reign without being formally declared. The Princess Royal wanted William prepared, but she would not allow ambition, panic, or convenience to erase her brother before his time. Camilla listened as schedules, briefings, and public appearances shifted toward the heir. She felt excluded from decisions that now shaped her husband's days. The Queen Consort feared that illness was stripping away not only Charles's authority, but also her ability to protect his personal wishes. Anne noticed her silence and assured her that temporary arrangements would not become permanent without resistance. William opened a sealed instruction signed by the king. The document authorised him to lead key state briefings, approve revised schedules, and represent the Crown during treatment. It also named Anne as the person responsible for ensuring every decision remained faithful to Charles's intentions. Her influence was now enormous, and the room grew still. As that truth settled, William faced his first decision immediately. He cancelled a major royal appearance that his father had personally insisted must proceed. The signature preserved the institution, but the cancellation exposed its emotional cost. Charles would not experience it as protection. He would see it as proof that the world had begun moving without him. The fallout began not with public panic, but with a single revised page placed beside the king's bed. An engagement he had prepared for over many months had been removed. William would attend in his place. Charles read the change twice, set the paper down, and stared toward the closed door. In that silence, he understood that illness had achieved what opposition never could. It had forced him to surrender the rhythm of his reign. Charles picked up a pen and circled the cancelled National Remembrance Ceremony. The event honoured those lost in service, and his absence mattered, because the sovereign's presence carried both personal and national meaning. Doctors had ruled that the journey, prolonged standing, and public pressure created an unacceptable risk. The king still asked why no one had consulted him before removing his own name. Camilla watched anger collapse into grief. She sat beside her husband as he admitted that he no longer knew whether people were obeying him or protecting him from himself. The Queen Consort reminded him that the decision had been made to keep him alive, but her reassurance could not erase the humiliation. Charles had spent years waiting to serve, and now the machinery of service was learning to move without him. William refused to reverse the cancellation. The prince knew his decision had wounded his father and strengthened whispers that the heir was taking control too quickly. Yet the medical warning left no room for compromise. Upcoming engagements were redistributed, with Anne covering ceremonial duties while other working royals absorbed regional visits. That restructuring mattered because every replacement protected continuity. But every replacement also made the king's absence more visible. Anne confronted Camilla after learning she had encouraged Charles to consider one final public appearance. The Princess Royal understood the impulse, but she warned that hope could become pressure when a sick man believed love required him to prove his strength. Camilla defended herself, saying she had only wanted to give her husband something to fight toward. Neither woman raised her voice, but both understood the stakes. Doctors later delivered a private warning through a recorded medical briefing prepared for the family. Even a minor setback could permanently end Charles's ability to maintain a regular schedule. Catherine then found William reviewing accession-era briefing material late at night. An accession briefing explains the duties and decisions required when a new monarch takes the throne. He claimed the papers were precautionary, but she saw fear behind every page. Charles finally asked Anne to remain after everyone else left. As the palace reorganised itself around his absence, he turned to the sister who had known him before duty, hardened his voice, and what he told her would change the family's understanding of the crisis. When the room finally emptied, Charles no longer looked like a monarch defending his authority. He looked like an exhausted brother asking the only person he fully trusted to tell him the truth. Anne sat opposite him without papers, advisors, or ceremonial distance. For several moments, neither spoke. Then the king asked whether stepping back would make him a failure. Her answer transformed the crisis from a struggle against surrender into an act of love. Anne had stood beside her brother through family scandal, public criticism, and the long wait for the throne. That history mattered because she could challenge him without making him feel betrayed, and because Charles knew she understood the cost of duty better than almost anyone. The Princess Royal had spent years protecting the institution, but now she was trying to protect the man trapped inside it.